Montana Territory, 1872. The wind howled through the pines like a lonesome wolf, carrying the scent of snow and heartache across the rolling foothills of the Bitterroot Mountains. Frost Galloway stared across the valley from atop his dun stallion, his young face weathered beyond his 26 years. Morning light painted the landscape in hues of amber and gold, but the beauty was lost on him. In Frost's experience, beauty was just a mask the frontier wore before it took everything you loved. 3 years had passed since Delia Jameson had been taken from him, 3 years of empty nights and silent mornings. He'd built his ranch, the Running G, with calloused hands and stubborn will, turning a humble homestead into 500 acres of the finest grazing land in the territory. But success tasted like ash when there was no one to share it with. "Time to head back," he murmured to his horse, though the words were really meant for himself. The ranch hands would be wondering where he disappeared to before dawn. Again, Frost adjusted his worn Stetson over his sandy brown hair and turned the horse toward home. At 26, most men his age were starting families, but Frost believed the frontier was no place for love. Love made you vulnerable, and vulnerability got you killed out west. Better to focus on survival and building something that would last. That's what he told himself anyway, each night as he stared at the ceiling of his empty bedroom in the 2-story house he'd built for a bride who would never cross its threshold. The Running G came into view as he crested the final hill, a neat cluster of buildings with the main house standing proud against the mountain backdrop. Smoke curled from the chimney of the bunkhouse, where his 4 ranch hands would be finishing their breakfast before heading out to mend the north fence line. Jeb, his foreman, was already saddling his horse by the corral. The man looked up as Frost approached, concern lining his face. "Thought you might have decided to ride all the way to Helena this time," Jeb said, his graveled voice carrying across the yard. Frost dismounted with practiced ease, just checking the eastern pasture. "Before sunup." With no coffee, Jeb raised a bushy eyebrow. "Been 3 years, boss, maybe it's time you." The men ready to head out, Frost cut him off, leading his horse to the water trough. Jeb sighed, "Yes, sir. But there's someone waiting for you in the house. Woman rode in about an hour ago, said she needed to speak with you personal-like." Frost frowned. "What woman?" "Didn't give her name, older lady, dressed peculiar. Said she knew your father." Few things could have compelled Frost to hurry toward the main house. Mention of his father was one of them. Clayton Galloway had died 2 years prior, leaving Frost truly alone in the world. Anyone connected to his father deserved at least a moment of his time. The woman sat at his kitchen table like she belonged there, sipping tea from one of the china cups Frost kept in the cabinet but never used. Her silver hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and she wore a dark dress adorned with strange symbols embroidered in red thread. Her eyes, sharp and knowing, fixed on him the moment he entered. "Mr. Galloway," she said, setting down her cup, "I was beginning to think you might avoid me entirely." "I understand you knew my father," Frost said, remaining in the doorway. "Clayton and I had an arrangement once. I've come to offer you something similar." She gestured to the chair across from her. "Won't you sit? This conversation requires proper attention." Against his better judgment, Frost removed his hat and took the offered seat. "What's your name, ma'am?" "Some call me Madame Verna, others have less flattering names." Her smile revealed teeth too perfect for a woman her age. "I'm what people in these parts might call a witch, Mr. Galloway, though I prefer practitioner of the old ways." Frost nearly stood up then. He had no patience for charlatans or superstitious nonsense, but something in her expression, a certainty that bordered on amusement, kept him seated. "What do you want?" he asked. "It's not what I want, but what you want." She reached into a small leather pouch at her waist and withdrew what appeared to be a lock of chestnut-colored hair tied with blue ribbon. 3 years ago, Delia Jameson was taken from you. Consumption, they said, though we both know it was more complicated than that. The sound of her name struck Frost like a physical blow. No one in these parts mentioned Delia anymore, not to him. "How do you know about her?" His voice had grown dangerously quiet. "I know many things, Mr. Galloway. I know that she was 19 when you met her at the Founders' Day dance in Billings. I know that her father opposed your courtship because you were just a ranch hand then, with no prospects. I know that you were to be married in the spring of '69, but she fell ill that winter." Madame Verna leaned forward. "And I know that her body was never found after she was taken to the sanatorium in Helena." Frost's hands clenched into fists beneath the table. "If you've come to dredge up old wounds." I've come to heal them. She placed the lock of hair between them. Your Delia isn't dead, Mr. Galloway. She exists in a place between worlds, and I can bring her back to you. The room seemed to tilt sideways. Frost steadied himself against the table, his heart pounding in his chest. That's impossible. Is it? Your father didn't think so. He sought me out after her disappearance, but the price was too high for him to pay. I wonder if you'll be braver. My father would never. Clayton Galloway was a practical man who became desperate when his only son started drinking himself to death. Her words cut like a knife. He found me in Helena 3 months after you lost her, asked if there was anything to be done. Frost stood abruptly, nearly knocking over his chair. Get out of my house. Madame Verna remained seated, unmoved by his anger. The ritual requires 3 things, something she possessed in life, a place she loved most in this world, and a sacrifice from the one who wishes her return. She rose smoothly to her feet. Think on it, Mr. Galloway. I'll return in 3 days for your answer. She swept past him, pausing at the door. Oh, and Mr. Galloway, when she returns, she'll have no memory of the time that's passed. To her, it will be the day she fell ill. Be prepared for that. Then she was gone, leaving only the lock of hair on the table and the scent of something foreign, herbs and smoke, lingering in the air. Frost stared at the chestnut strand, his hand hovering above it. He recognized that ribbon. He'd given it to Delia himself, a trinket from the mercantile in town. She'd worn it to tie back her hair the day he proposed by the creek that ran through what was now his property. He snatched his hand away as if burned. This was madness. Delia was dead. He'd accepted that fact years ago, even if he'd never truly moved on. This woman was nothing but a fraud preying on his grief. Yet as he stormed out to join his men on the fence line, the witch's words echoed in his mind. Delia's body had never been found. The sanatorium had sent word that she'd passed in the night, but when Frost had ridden to Helena to claim her, they'd told him she'd already been buried in the pauper's field. No marker, no grave to visit. The rest of the day passed in a blur of physical labor, mending fences, checking cattle, anything to exhaust his body and quiet his mind. But as twilight settled over the ranch, Frost found himself in the small bedroom off the kitchen that he'd converted to storage. Inside a cedar chest, beneath a folded quilt, lay a simple white dress with tiny blue flowers embroidered along the collar. Delia's wedding dress. She'd been so proud of it, sewn with her own hands in anticipation of their spring wedding. Frost ran his fingers over the fabric, remembering how her eyes had lit up when she'd shown it to him, making him promise not to peek at the finished garment until their wedding day. This is foolishness, he whispered to the empty room, yet he couldn't bring himself to close the chest. That night he dreamed of Delia for the first time in months. Not the nightmare of her wasting away in a sanatorium bed, but Delia as she had been, vibrant and laughing, her chestnut hair catching the sunlight as she stood by the creek, her favorite place on his land. In the dream, she turned to him with a question in her eyes, her blue dress, the one she'd worn the day he proposed, swirling around her ankles in the breeze. Why haven't you come for me, Frost? She asked, her voice as clear as if she stood before him. I've been waiting. He woke with tears on his face and a decision in his heart. 3 days later, Madame Verna returned as promised. She found Frost waiting on the porch, the wedding dress folded neatly beside him, the lock of hair resting on top. You've made your choice, I see, she said, climbing the steps with surprising agility for a woman her age. What's the sacrifice? Frost asked without preamble. If it's money. The old magic doesn't care for money, mister. Galloway, she sat beside him, her dark eyes reflecting the sunset. The sacrifice is time, your time. I don't understand. For every year she lives after her return, you will sacrifice 1 year of your own life. Not from the end, that would be too easy. From now, you will age 1 year for every month that passes until the debt is paid. Frost stared at her, calculating quickly. 3 years have passed, that's 36 months. 3 years of her life for 3 years of yours, compressed into 3 months. She nodded. By winter's first snow, you will be as your father was before he died. Clayton Galloway had died a withered old man of 68. Frost would be 29 by calendar, but nearly 60 in body when the sacrifice was complete. And if I die before the 3 months are up. Then she returns to the place between worlds. Madame Verna's expression softened slightly. It is not a cruel place, Mr. Galloway. She feels no pain there, no passage of time, but it is not life either. Frost looked out over his land. the cattle grazing in the distance, the barn he'd built with his own hands, the creek where he'd asked Delia to be his wife. He'd spent 3 years building a life that felt hollow without her. "I'll do it," he said quietly. "Tell me what I need to do." The ritual took place that night under a crescent moon. Following the witch's instructions, Frost carried the wedding dress to the creek bank where he'd proposed to Delia. Madame Verna walked behind him, humming a melody that made the hair on his neck stand on end. At the creek, she directed him to lay the dress on a flat stone near the water's edge. She placed the lock of hair atop it and sprinkled herbs from her pouch around them in a circle. The sharp scent of sage and something metallic filled the air. "Now your blood," she said, holding out a small silver knife, 7 drops on the hair. Frost took the knife without hesitation and pricked his finger, letting the blood fall where she indicated. Each drop seemed to disappear into the chestnut strands. "Speak her name 3 times and your promise once," Madame Verna instructed, stepping back from the circle. Frost closed his eyes, his heart thundering in his chest. "Delia Jameson," he said, his voice gaining strength with each repetition. "Delia Jameson, Delia Jameson, I promise to give my time for yours." For a moment, nothing happened. The night remained still, the only sound the gentle gurgling of the creek. Frost opened his eyes, a crushing disappointment beginning to settle in his chest. Then the air around the dress began to shimmer, like heat rising from sun-baked earth. The shimmer grew, taking shape, solidifying until suddenly, impossibly, Delia lay on the stone where her dress had been, wearing the same blue dress she'd worn the day he proposed. Her chest rose and fell with steady breaths. Her skin, once pale with illness, now held the warm glow of health. Her chestnut hair spilled around her like a halo in the moonlight. Frost couldn't move, couldn't breathe. He was afraid that any action might shatter this miracle before him. Then Delia's eyes fluttered open, those familiar hazel eyes that had haunted his dreams for 3 long years. She looked confused for a moment, then focused on his face. Frost, her voice was exactly as he remembered, sweet and clear with that slight lilt that revealed her Kentucky origins. "What happened? Why are we at the creek?" He fell to his knees beside her, gathering her hands in his. They were warm. "Real, you've been ill," he managed to say, his voice thick with emotion, "but you're better now." When he looked up to thank Madame Verna, the witch was gone. Only a small leather pouch remained where she had stood, with a note attached. "For the pain that will come." Frost tucked the pouch into his jacket pocket and helped Delia to her feet. She swayed slightly, leaning into his embrace. "I had the strangest dream," she said as they walked slowly back toward the ranch house. "I dreamed I was floating in darkness, and I could hear you calling my name, but I couldn't find my way to you." "You're here now," Frost said, his arm tight around her waist. "That's all that matters." He felt a twinge in his joints as they walked, a stiffness that hadn't been there that morning. The sacrifice had begun. The next few days were a blur of joy and rediscovery. To Delia, no time had passed. Her last memory was of falling ill at her father's house in town. Frost explained that she'd been brought to his ranch to recover, spinning a tale about the doctor recommending country air. If she wondered why her father hadn't come to check on her, she didn't voice her concerns. Frost introduced her to the ranch he'd built, watching her delight as she explored the house he'd designed with her in mind. The kitchen with its large windows overlooking the garden plot. The parlor with built-in bookshelves for the collection she'd always dreamed of starting. The main bedroom upstairs with the quilt frame he'd commissioned from the carpenter in town. "It's like you read my mind," she said, turning in a slow circle in the bedroom. "This is exactly how I imagined our home would be." He didn't tell her that he'd built it from the sketches she'd shown him before their wedding, the plans they'd made together for their future. Let her think it was the magic of 2 hearts beating as one. Frost kept his transformation hidden as best he could. Each morning he noted new changes, a deepening of the lines around his eyes, a slight stoop to his shoulders, a few silver strands appearing in his hair. He took the herbal mixture from the witch's pouch when the aches became too much to bear, careful to keep the small leather bag hidden from Delia. 2 weeks after her return, Frost took Delia into town for supplies. He'd warned his ranch hands not to mention the passage of time or Delia's illness, but he couldn't control what others might say. Still, it seemed safer than leaving her alone at the ranch while questions formed in her mind. Billings had grown in the 3 years since Delia had last seen it. New buildings lined Main Street, and unfamiliar faces turned to watch them pass. Frost had aged enough that few recognized him immediately, which suited his purposes. He kept his hat pulled low and steered Delia toward the general store with a protective hand at her back. Inside, Mrs. Patterson stood behind the counter, her eyes widening as they entered. The older woman had known Delia well, had in fact attended her funeral service. "Morning, Mrs. Patterson," Frost said quickly, giving the woman a pointed look. "My fiancé and I have come for supplies." To her credit, Mrs. Patterson recovered swiftly. "Of course, Mr. Galloway, Miss Jameson, how lovely to see you looking so well." Delia smiled, oblivious to the undertones. "Thank you. It feels wonderful to be up and about again after being ill." While Delia browsed the fabric selection, Mrs. Patterson cornered Frost by the seed display. "Everyone said she died," the storekeeper whispered. "There was a service. Her father moved back east afterward." "There was a mistake," Frost said firmly. "As you can see, she's very much alive." "But you look," Mrs. Patterson's eyes darted over his face, noting the changes that were becoming harder to hide. "A bout of fever myself," he said dismissively. "Nothing serious." Mrs. Patterson clearly didn't believe him, but she was too polite to press further. News would spread quickly through town, however. Frost knew they had limited time before more difficult questions arose. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Delia finally asked the question he'd been dreading. "Why hasn't my father come to see me?" she asked, her fingers working at her embroidery hoop. She was adding those same tiny blue flowers to handkerchiefs now, his handkerchiefs. "It's been over 2 weeks since I fell ill." Frost had prepared for this. He had to return to Kentucky on business. He received word that your uncle had passed. "Uncle Thomas," her needle paused mid-stitch. "That's terrible news. Father must be devastated, they were so close. He didn't want to leave you, but I promised to care for you until his return." Frost reached for her hand, hating the lies but seeing no alternative. "When did he leave?" "Just before you began to improve." He should be back within the month. Another lie to buy time. Thomas Jameson had indeed died, but it had happened 2 years ago, long after Herbert Jameson had sold his property and moved back east, broken by his daughter's death. Delia set her embroidery aside and moved to sit beside him on the porch swing. In the fading light, she studied his face with a small frown forming between her brows. "You look tired, Frost," she said, touching his cheek gently. "Are you sure you're not working too hard?" He captured her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "I've never been better." That night he dreamed of the witch again. She stood at the foot of his bed, watching him with those dark, knowing eyes. "You're aging faster than I anticipated," she said, her voice seeming to come from inside his head rather than her mouth. "Your love for her is accelerating the process." "Is there any way to slow it?" he asked in the dream. "Distance yourself from her. Each touch, each shared joy speeds your sacrifice." Frost shook his head. "I won't waste a moment of the time we have." The witch's expression softened. "Then use it well, for it passes more quickly than you know." He woke to find Delia sleeping peacefully beside him, her chestnut hair spread across the pillow, her hand resting near his. Careful not to wake her, Frost slipped from the bed and went to the mirror hanging on the wall. The face that stared back at him was that of a man in his late 30s, his hairline receding slightly, crow's feet etched permanently around his eyes, the first deep lines forming across his forehead. At this rate, he wouldn't last the 3 months Madame Verna had predicted, but as he looked back at Delia's sleeping form, he couldn't bring himself to regret his choice. Better a short life with her than decades without. The following week brought new challenges. Delia began to notice discrepancies in his stories, questions he couldn't answer about events that should have been recent but had actually occurred years ago, and the changes in his appearance were becoming impossible to dismiss as mere exhaustion or illness. "I found this in the study," she said one evening, holding up a deed dated the previous year. "It says you purchased the Jenkins parcel to expand the ranch, but Mr. Jenkins told me just last summer that he'd never sell his land." Frost set down his coffee cup, his hand shaking slightly with the effort. At 45, his apparent age now, arthritis had begun to settle in his joints, a constant reminder of the price he was paying. "Willard changed his mind after the drought hit," he said, which was true enough. His wells went dry, and he needed capital to move his family to Oregon. Delia set the deed down and perched on the edge of his desk. "Frost, what aren't you telling me? And don't say it's nothing, I know you too well." The earnestness in her eyes nearly broke his resolve. How simple it would be to tell her everything, the truth of her death, the witch's bargain, the sacrifice he was making. But what would that knowledge do to her? Would she blame herself for every new wrinkle that appeared on his face, every gray hair that emerged overnight? "I've been worried about you," he said instead, taking her hands in his. "The doctor said your recovery might be fragile, that too much excitement or upset could cause a relapse." Her expression softened. "Is that why you've been keeping me close to the ranch? Why you tense up whenever someone from town visits?" "I can't risk losing you again," he said, the truth of those words burning in his chest. Delia leaned forward and kissed him softly. "You won't lose me. I'm stronger than you think." That night, for the first time since her return, they made love. Frost had been hesitant, afraid his aging body would repulse her, but Delia's desire matched his own. In the darkness, with only moonlight filtering through the curtains, she didn't seem to notice the changes in his physique, or if she did, she didn't care. Afterward, as she slept in his arms, Frost felt a decade slip from him in a single rush. He bit back a groan as his hair whitened at the temples and lines deepened across his face. The sacrifice accelerated with intimacy, just as the witch had warned in his dream. Frost eased himself from the bed, his joints protesting with each movement, and made his way downstairs to his study. There, by lamplight, he wrote 2 letters. The first to Jeb, instructing him on the running of the ranch and the care of Delia should anything happen to him. The second to Delia herself, explaining everything, her death, the witch's bargain, his sacrifice. This letter he sealed and placed in his desk drawer, to be delivered only if he didn't survive to the end of the 3 months. A soft noise at the doorway made him look up. Delia stood there in her nightgown, her hair loose around her shoulders. "Frost, what are you doing up at this hour?" She stepped into the room, then froze as the lamplight revealed his face. "Oh my God, what's happened to you?" He couldn't hide it anymore. The transformation had accelerated too rapidly. The man who faced her now looked nearly 60, silver-haired, deeply lined, his shoulders stooped with age. "I can explain," he began, but the words died on his lips as Delia swayed, her face draining of color. "This isn't possible," she whispered, gripping the doorframe for support. "You were young just hours ago. This can't be real." Frost moved toward her, but she backed away, fear evident in her eyes. "Who are you?" she demanded. "What have you done with Frost?" "Delia, it's me," he pleaded, holding out his hands. "I'm still me." But she was already backing down the hallway, shaking her head in denial. Before he could reach her, she turned and fled up the stairs, the sound of their bedroom door slamming echoing through the house. Frost sank into his desk chair, burying his face in his hands. He'd known this moment would come, but he'd hoped for more time, just a few more precious weeks before she discovered the truth. He spent the rest of the night in his study, dozing fitfully in the chair as dawn approached. When he finally heard Delia's footsteps on the stairs, he straightened, ignoring the protest of his aged spine. She appeared in the doorway, fully dressed, her face composed but pale. She'd been crying, he could see the evidence in her reddened eyes, but now she seemed calm, determined. "I want the truth," she said simply, taking the chair across from his desk. "All of it." So he told her. About her illness that had progressed too quickly for medicine to combat. About her transfer to the sanatorium in Helena when her father had run out of options. About the letter that arrived 3 weeks later, informing them of her death. About the 3 years he'd spent building the ranch and the life they'd planned together, trying to outrun his grief. And finally, about Madame Verna's visit and the bargain he'd struck. "I don't understand," Delia said when he finished, her voice small in the morning light. "How could I have died? I'm here, I'm alive." "The witch said you were in a place between worlds," Frost explained gently. "Not truly dead, but not alive either. She brought you back, but the price was my time. So you're giving up years of your life for me." Tears welled in her eyes. "How much time do you have left?" Frost reached across the desk and took her hand. It felt so young and smooth compared to his now weathered skin. "I don't know exactly. The process has been accelerating, but I don't regret a single moment, Delia. Having you back, even for this short time, has been worth everything." "How can you say that?" she cried, pulling her hand away. "You're dying before my eyes, and it's because of me." "No," he said firmly. "It's because of my choice, my love. Would you not have done the same for me?" The question hung between them, unanswerable in its truth. They both knew she would have made the same sacrifice had their positions been reversed. Delia rose from her chair and came around the desk, kneeling beside him. Up close, she could see every new line on his face, every silver strand in his hair. Yet his eyes, those clear blue eyes, remained unchanged. The same eyes that had looked at her with wonder at the Founders' Day dance, with love by the creek, with joy when she'd accepted his proposal. "We have to find her," she said, determination replacing despair in her voice. "This witch, maybe there's another way." "I've thought of that," Frost admitted, "but I don't know how to find her. She appeared when she chose to, and I have no idea where she might be now." "Then we'll search, we'll ask in town, in Helena, wherever we need to go." Delia stood, pulling at his hand. "Come on. We can start today." But when Frost tried to stand, his legs nearly buckled beneath him. The night in the chair had stiffened his joints beyond their ability to function properly. Delia had to help him to the sofa, alarm written across her features. "You can't travel like this," she said, the reality of their situation sinking in, "and I can't leave you." "Jeb can go," Frost suggested, hating the weakness in his voice. "He can ask around in Helena, see if anyone knows of this Madame Verna." Delia nodded, already moving toward the door. "I'll find him right now." But Jeb's search proved fruitless. After a week of inquiries in Helena and the surrounding settlements, he returned with no information about the silver-haired witch. No one admitted to knowing a Madame Verna, though several people crossed themselves at the mention of witchcraft. During that week, Frost's condition deteriorated rapidly. By the time Jeb returned, he was confined to his bed, his once strong body now that of a man in his 70s. The herbal mixture from the witch's pouch helped with the pain but couldn't halt the transformation. Delia refused to leave his side, reading to him when he was awake, watching over him when he slept. She'd moved past her initial shock and horror, her love proving stronger than any fear or regret. "I've been thinking," she said one evening as she bathed his forehead with a cool cloth, "about what you told me, about being in a place between worlds." Frost opened his eyes, focusing on her with effort. "What about it?" "I don't remember anything from those 3 years. Not darkness, not light, not floating as I said when I first returned." Her brow furrowed in concentration. "But sometimes, when I'm half asleep, I get flashes of something, a woman's voice, silver hair, instructions." Frost tried to sit up, wincing at the pain that lanced through his back. "Madame Verna, you remember her?" "Not exactly." Delia helped him settle against the pillows. "It's more like she left something inside me, a knowledge I didn't have before." "What kind of knowledge?" "I'm not sure yet." She set the cloth aside and took his hand, her eyes troubled. "But I think I might be able to find her. Or at least call to her somehow." Hope flickered in Frost's chest for the first time in days. "How?" "I need to go to the creek, to the place where I came back." Delia squeezed his hand. "Would you be all right if I leave you for a little while?" He nodded, though the thought of her venturing out alone made him uneasy. "Take Jeb with you." "No," she said firmly. "This is something I have to do alone." Before he could protest further, she leaned down and kissed him, her lips warm against his papery skin. "Trust me," she whispered, "as I trusted you when you brought me back." The walk to the creek seemed longer than Delia remembered. Perhaps because this time, she made the journey with the weight of knowledge pressing down on her, knowledge of death and sacrifice, of a love so powerful it could defy natural law. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as she reached the flat stone where she had awakened 3 weeks earlier. In the daylight, it looked ordinary, just a large, smooth rock beside a gently flowing creek. But as she approached, Delia felt a strange resonance, as if the air itself recognized her. She settled onto the stone, arranging her skirts around her, and closed her eyes. The flashes of memory, or whatever they were, had been strongest when she was in a twilight state between waking and sleeping. She tried to recreate that feeling now, letting her mind drift while remaining aware of the sun on her face, the sound of water over rocks. "I know you can hear me," she said aloud, her voice steady despite the trembling of her hands. "You brought me back for him. Now I need your help to save him." For long moments, nothing happened. The creek continued its endless journey. Birds called from the trees, and the afternoon light began its slow transformation to evening. Just as Delia was about to give up, a cool breeze stirred the hair at the nape of her neck. She opened her eyes to find Madame Verna standing on the opposite bank, looking exactly as Frost had described her. You've recovered your voice quickly, child, the witch said, stepping across the creek as easily as if it were solid ground. Most who return from the in-between spaces take much longer to remember their power. I don't have any power, Delia said, rising to her feet. I just knew somehow that you would hear me if I came here. That, my dear, is power. Madame Verna stopped before her, dark eyes assessing. You called and I came. Few can summon me against my will. Then you know why I've called you. Frost is dying. He is fulfilling his bargain, the witch corrected, giving his time for yours. It is an exchange freely made. There must be another way, Delia pleaded. Take some of my time instead, share the burden between us. Madame Verna tilted her head, considering. The magic doesn't work that way. The sacrifice must come from a single heart, freely given. Then take me back. The words left Delia's lips before she fully formed the thought. Return me to the place between worlds and restore his years to him. You would give up your life again. After he sacrificed so much to bring you back, the witch's expression remained impassive, but something like respect flickered in her eyes. I can't watch him die for me, Delia said simply. I won't. Madame Verna was silent for a long moment, her gaze seeming to look through Delia rather than at her. Finally, she nodded once. There is a third option, she said. Though it comes with its own price. Name it, Delia said without hesitation. I can bind your life forces together. The years he has sacrificed would be shared between you. He would age more rapidly than normal, and you more slowly, until you reach the same point. The witch began to pace around Delia in a slow circle. He would still appear older than his true age, but not so dramatically. Perhaps 10 years rather than 40, and you would age more quickly than natural, appearing 10 years older than your true age. So instead of him becoming an old man in 3 months, we would both become middle-aged, Delia tried to understand. Precisely, the debt would be paid over years rather than months. You would have a life together, though shorter than most. And the price for this binding, Delia asked, knowing there must be more. You can never be parted. Not for a day, not for an hour. The magic requires proximity to balance between you. Madame Verna completed her circle, stopping before Delia once more. If you separate, even briefly, the aging will accelerate in him again, and you will begin to fade back to the in-between place. Delia didn't hesitate. I accept. So quickly, the witch raised an eyebrow, without consulting him. He gave his life for me without asking. I can give part of mine for him. Delia lifted her chin. And I have no desire to be parted from him anyway. A smile curved Madame Verna's lips, the first genuine expression Delia had seen on her face. Love, she murmured. Such a powerful magic in itself. She reached into her pouch and withdrew a small silver knife, the same one Frost had used in the ritual to bring Delia back. Your blood, freely given, she said, holding out the knife. 7 drops on the stone where you returned to this world. Delia took the knife and pricked her finger without flinching. 7 crimson drops fell onto the gray stone, seeming to sink into the very rock itself. Now speak the words. What was divided, let it be shared. What was sacrificed, let it be halved. His time, my time, our time is one. Delia repeated the words, her voice growing stronger with each phrase. As she spoke the final word, a wind whipped around them, stirring the leaves and rippling the creek's surface. For an instant, Delia felt as if she were being pulled in 2 directions at once, toward the ranch where Frost lay dying, and toward some dark, formless place beyond her understanding. Then the sensation passed, leaving her gasping on the stone, Madame Verna's hand steadying her shoulder. It is done, the witch said. Go to him now. The binding will complete when you touch. Will I see you again? Delia asked as the older woman turned to leave. Madame Verna paused, looking back over her shoulder. I think not. My work here is finished. A hint of that smile returned. Live well with the time you have, Delia Jameson. Few are granted a second chance. Then she was gone, as suddenly as she had appeared, leaving Delia alone by the creek with the setting sun painting the water gold. Delia ran most of the way back to the ranch, her heart pounding with equal parts fear and hope. What if she was too late? What if the binding didn't work as promised? The main house came into view just as dusk was settling over the valley. Lights burned in the windows, and Jeb stood on the porch, his expression grim as he spotted her approaching. Miss Delia, he called, hurrying down the steps to meet her. The boss has taken a bad turn. Doc Simmons is with him now. Terror clutched at Delia's heart as she rushed past Jeb and into the house. She took the stairs two at a time, ignoring the startled exclamation from Mrs. Peterson, who had come from town to help care for Frost. The bedroom door stood open. Inside, Dr. Simmons bent over the bed where Frost lay still and pale, his white hair stark against the pillows. The doctor straightened as Delia burst into the room, his face solemn. "Miss Jameson," he began, "I'm afraid." "No," she cut him off, pushing past him to reach Frost's side. "He's not gone, he can't be." Frost's chest still rose and fell with shallow breaths, but his skin had a grayish cast, and his eyes remained closed despite her presence. He looked ancient, far older than his father had been when he died. "I've done all I can," Dr. Simmons said gently. "His heart is failing. It's as if he's aged 50 years in a month." "I've never seen anything like it." Delia barely heard him. She climbed onto the bed and gathered Frost's frail body into her arms, heedless of propriety or the doctor's presence. "I made a bargain," she whispered against Frost's ear. "Just as you did for me, come back to me now." For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then Frost's body jerked in her arms as if struck by lightning. Simultaneously, Delia felt a shock race through her own system, a burning sensation that started where her skin touched his and radiated outward until her entire body felt aflame. "Doctor!" Simmons shouted in alarm, moving toward the bed, but Jeb caught his arm. "Wait," the foreman said, his eyes fixed on the extraordinary scene before them. Frost's hair was darkening from white to gray to a salt and pepper mix before their eyes. The deep lines on his face were softening, flesh filling out over two prominent bones. At the same time, Delia's appearance was subtly altering, a few strands of silver appearing in her chestnut hair, fine lines forming at the corners of her eyes and mouth. When the transformation stabilized, the man in Delia's arms appeared to be in his mid-30s rather than his 70s, while she looked closer to 30 than her actual 22 years. Frost's eyes fluttered open, focusing immediately on Delia's face. "What did you do?" he whispered, his voice stronger than it had been in days. "I shared the burden," she answered, tears of relief streaming down her cheeks. "As you would have done for me." Dr. Simmons approached cautiously, his medical bag clutched in white-knuckled hands. "What in God's name just happened?" "A miracle, Doc," Jeb said from the doorway, his weathered face split by a rare grin. "Best not question it too closely." The doctor insisted on examining both of them, his bewilderment growing with each test. Frost's heart, which had been failing hours earlier, now beat strong and steady. His lungs, previously congested, drew clear, deep breaths. Only his appearance, still aged beyond his 26 years, suggested anything unusual had occurred. "I can't explain it, Doctor." Simmons admitted finally, packing away his stethoscope. "By all rights, you should be dead, Mr. Galloway. Instead, you seem to have recovered." "Thank you for your help, Doctor," Frost said, sitting up in bed without assistance. "I'm feeling much improved." After the doctor departed, still shaking his head in disbelief, and Mrs. Peterson had been sent home with profuse thanks, Frost and Delia were finally alone. Jeb had promised to keep the other ranch hands away from the main house for the evening, giving them privacy to come to terms with their new reality. "You could have died," Frost said, tracing the new lines at the corner of her eye with a gentle finger. "Why would you risk that?" "For the same reason you did," Delia replied simply, "because a life without you isn't worth living." She explained Madame Verna's bargain, how their life forces were now bound together, sharing the burden of the years he had sacrificed. How they could never be separated without consequences, how they would age faster than normal but would have years together rather than mere months. "So I'm stuck with you," Frost said when she finished, a smile tugging at his lips. "Forever." "Forever," she agreed, leaning in to kiss him. "Though I expect you to make an honest woman of me sooner rather than later, Mr. Galloway." They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Billings. The ceremony raised eyebrows, not for the hasty arrangements which were common enough on the frontier, but for the appearance of the couple. The groom looked a decade older than anyone remembered, and the bride several years older than her actual age. But the love between them was palpable, silencing even the most persistent gossips. Herbert Jameson never returned from the East, of course, but Delia wrote to him at his last known address, sharing the news of her marriage and extending an invitation to visit. The letter was returned unopened, marked recipient deceased. Delia mourned her father's passing but found comfort in knowing he had died believing she awaited him in heaven. life settled into a rhythm at the running G. Frost and Delia worked side by side, expanding the ranch and building the life they had once only dreamed about. They were rarely apart, the witches warning about separation keeping them close even when ranch business might have taken Frost away. When he needed to make cattle drives to Helena or Butte, Delia rode beside him, earning the respect of the cowboys who worked for them. Their aging continued at an accelerated pace, though not so dramatically as before. By the time Frost was 30, 4 years after Delia's return, he appeared to be in his early 40s, while she looked to be in her mid-30s rather than 26. The burden shared between them was manageable, allowing them to live active, fulfilling lives. In the spring of 1878, their family grew with the birth of a daughter, whom they named Hope. 2 years later, a son joined the family, Clayton, after Frost's father. The children brought new joy to the ranch and a renewed sense of purpose to their parents, who knew their time together might be shorter than most. As the years passed, the running G prospered. Frost's innovative ranching methods and Delia's careful management of their finances made them one of the most successful operations in the territory. They built a school for the children of their workers and their own, established a small clinic in town with a permanent doctor, and became known throughout the region for their generosity and fairness. If anyone noticed that the Galloways aged more quickly than their neighbors, that Frost's hair was completely silver by 40, while Delia's chestnut locks were streaked with gray in her 30s, they attributed it to the hard work of frontier life. Only Jeb knew the truth, and he carried their secret to his grave when he passed peacefully in his sleep after 20 years as foreman of the running G on their 20th wedding anniversary. Frost and Delia rode out to the creek that had witnessed both her return and their binding. Though Frost was only 46 by the calendar, he resembled a man in his late 60s, his one straight back now slightly stooped, his hands thickened with arthritis. Delia, chronologically 38, had the appearance of a woman in her early 50s, still beautiful to her husband's eyes, but marked by the accelerated passage of time. They sat together on the flat stone where it had all begun, watching the water flow past as the setting sun gilded the landscape. "Do you ever regret it?" Delia asked, her head resting on his shoulder. "The bargain you made." Frost considered the question seriously, as he always did when she asked it. "Not for a moment," he answered finally. "These 20 years with you have been worth everything. Even knowing we won't grow truly old together. That Hope and Clayton will lose us sooner than they should. Our children are strong like their mother." Frost pressed a kiss to her graying hair. "And we've given them everything we could, love, education, values that will serve them well. Hope is already showing signs of being a better rancher than I ever was, and Clayton's acceptance to that law school back east proves he's got more brains than both of us combined." Delia smiled at the pride in his voice. "They are remarkable, aren't they? I wonder sometimes what Madame Verna would think of them." "I imagine she knew all along what would happen," Frost said thoughtfully. "Perhaps this was her plan from the beginning, not just to bring you back or to bind us together, but to create something new through our children." "A new kind of magic," Delia murmured, watching as a pair of eagles soared above the creek, their wings catching the last golden rays of sunlight. They didn't speak of it often, but both had noticed certain abilities in their children. Hope's uncanny way with animals, how they seemed to understand her intentions without commands. Clayton's dreams that sometimes revealed events before they happened. Small things, easily dismissed by rational minds, but unmistakable to parents who had experienced the impossible themselves. "Do you think she'll ever return?" Frost asked, his arm tightening around Delia's waist. "Madame Verna." "No," Delia said with quiet certainty. "Her work here is finished, as she told me that day. But I think perhaps she watches sometimes, from whatever place she calls home." As if in answer to her words, a cool breeze stirred the grass around them, carrying the faint scent of sage and something metallic, the same scent that had filled the air on the night of Delia's return. "Thank you," Frost whispered to the wind, "for everything." The breeze swirled once more around them, then was gone, leaving only the gentle sounds of the creek and the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. Hand in hand, Frost and Delia made their way back to the ranch house, where lamps glowed in the windows and their children waited to celebrate their anniversary. Their steps were slower than they had once been, their bodies bearing the marks of their shared sacrifice, but their hearts remained as they had always been, bound together by a love strong enough to transcend death itself. In the years that followed, the story of Frost and Delia Galloway became something of a legend in Montana territory. Not the true story, of course, that remained known only to them and was later passed down to their children as a sacred trust. But people spoke of their remarkable devotion, how they were never separated, how the love between them seemed to defy the natural order of things. When Frost passed away at the age of 62, appearing to be well into his 80s, Delia followed within hours, just as they had known she would. They were buried together on a hillside overlooking the creek, beneath a granite marker inscribed with words Frost had chosen years before: what was divided, now united; what was sacrificed, now redeemed. Our time is one for all eternity. And if on certain nights when the moon is new and the wind whispers through the pines, visitors to the old Running G Ranch claim to see a young couple walking hand in hand by the creek, well, that's just another frontier tale, isn't it? A story of a cowboy who spent years alone, until a witch brought his lost love back and taught them both that some bonds transcend even death itself.